The encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. By the time anyone could fully comprehend it, the balance of perception had already shifted. Bruce Lee and Mike Tyson were in the same space, unplanned, unannounced, and yet, within that brief convergence, the weight of authority was quietly established. Tyson's presence filled the room with inevitability. His reputation, speed, and raw power made others instinctively step back. And Bruce Lee, small in comparison, almost unassuming, stood calm, unmoving, his focus precise. No words were exchanged, no punches were thrown. And yet, those who witnessed it later agreed the outcome had already been determined, not by strength but by control. It was not a fight, it was a demonstration. And in those fleeting seconds, the hierarchy of understanding, the perception of mastery, and the nature of authority had been quietly rewritten. The space was unremarkable at first glance. A modest private training room tucked into the back of a gym, its walls lined with heavy bags, speed bags, and punching mitts. The floor bore scuff marks and sweat stains, evidence of countless hours of practice. Fluorescent lights hung from the ceiling, flickering faintly, casting uneven shadows across the room's surfaces. A single boxing ring occupied one corner, its ropes taut but worn, the canvas muted with the imprint of past battles. It was late afternoon. The few individuals present, assistants, trainers, and a small entourage, moved about with casual purpose, adjusting equipment, checking notes, or discussing schedules. Yet, beneath the ordinary rhythm, there was a tension that could be felt even before either man entered fully. Those in the room later recalled it as a subtle compression, like the air itself was waiting, alert, anticipatory. Bruce Lee had arrived first. He did not announce himself, nor did he command attention. He stood quietly at the edge of the training area, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes observing with a precision that made others uneasy. Nothing about his posture suggested urgency or preparation for confrontation, yet his awareness was complete, attuned to every movement, every sound, every subtle shift in the space around him. A trainer adjusting a bag might think him distracted, but his attention was on the room as a whole, the angles, the distances, the potential of movement within it. The subtlety of Bruce Lee's presence contrasted sharply with the energy that was about to enter. Where others moved with purpose or chatter, his stillness was complete. There was no effort to dominate the room. There was only observation, and in that observation lay authority, a quiet, unspoken assertion that presence and awareness carried their own weight. As the moments passed, the air seemed to thicken. Shadows fell in sharp lines across the floor, tracing the shapes of equipment, the ropes of the ring, the contours of the walls. Even in the absence of action, the space carried tension. People in the room, trainers, assistants, those who would later recount the story, felt an almost imperceptible shift in energy, as if the room itself were aware that something rare was about to occur. Then came the approach of another force. Before Mike Tyson entered, the room's atmosphere had already been measured by Bruce Lee's stillness. Each breath of the onlookers, each shuffle of a foot, each slight tilt of a shoulder was noted, absorbed. The anticipation was not dramatic or theatrical. It was subtle, controlled, and deeply felt. Observers described it later as a kind of compression, a hush in the ordinary noise of the gym, where the future of perception seemed to hinge on what would follow. The room was ready, though it did not yet know why. The stage was set, not by props, lights, or announcements, but by the quiet authority of presence. And in that quiet, the rules of the moment were already being established. This encounter would not rely on spectacle, nor on aggression. It would unfold through observation, restraint, and minimal but decisive action. The first step had been taken, not by movement, but by attention itself. The door to the training room opened with a soft click, and Mike Tyson entered. His presence was immediate, unmistakable, and fundamentally different from anything the room had felt so far that afternoon. He did not announce himself, and he did not speak. He walked with the economy of motion typical of a fighter in full awareness of his own capabilities. Shoulders squared, chest relaxed, hands hanging naturally at his sides, eyes surveying the space with a mixture of curiosity and focus. Even before he fully stepped into the light, his aura was recognized. Witnesses later described it as an invisible shift in energy, subtle but profound. Trainers instinctively straightened, assistants paused mid-task, and everyone in the room registered a quiet, almost instinctive respect for the presence that now filled the space. Tyson was large, muscular, and undeniably powerful, but it was not brute force alone that commanded attention. It was the certainty that accompanied his movement. Bruce Lee remained still. There was no flinch, no reaction, no outward acknowledgement beyond the calm observation already established. Yet, the dynamic of the room began to change immediately. Where before the tension had been latent, it now had an axis. Tyson's entry created the perception of potential dominance. The space was measured against him first, against his size, his reputation for speed and aggression. The observers were acutely aware of the juxtaposition. Here was Tyson, force made visible, presence made undeniable, entering a space already occupied by a figure whose authority was less tangible but no less potent. Bruce Lee's calm, measured posture contrasted sharply with Tyson's natural physicality. The interplay of these presences created an unspoken question in the room: which kind of mastery would define the moment? Tyson walked slowly, each step deliberate, scanning the equipment, noting the ring, the bags, the corners of the room. He did not look directly at Bruce Lee at first, but the awareness was mutual. Observers later remarked on the way Bruce's eyes followed Tyson, calm, precise, yet detached. There was no surprise in his gaze, only full comprehension. He had no need to assess in haste. His understanding of space, weight, and balance allowed him to measure Tyson as effortlessly as one might measure a shadow on a wall. The room's subtle tension was amplified by human response. A trainer adjusting gloves froze mid-motion. A young assistant shifted his weight slightly backward. A photographer present, intending to move closer for a shot, hesitated. These reactions were not dramatic. They were barely noticeable to the casual eye. Yet in retrospect, they were proof that Tyson's presence had altered the psychological center of the room. The hierarchy had begun to assert itself. Physicality had declared its claim, and everyone, including Bruce Lee, was aware of its weight. And yet, even with all that power in motion, there was no confrontation, no challenge issued. Tyson did not posture, did not display, did not dominate the space overtly. His authority was carried silently through certainty, through the ease with which he moved, and through the latent threat of motion inherent to a man of his skill. It was in this arrival that the stage for the encounter was fully established, a space of observation, judgment, and implicit measurement. One presence represented raw, kinetic force, the other represented stillness, control, and precision. Both would influence the room, both would be measured, but neither had yet acted. The quiet anticipation settled deeper. Bruce Lee's eyes, unwavering, scanned Tyson with the patience of someone who understood that authority could exist without noise, that dominance could be established without a single gesture. The room, the witnesses, the air itself had become a silent audience to the tension that now defined every inch of the space. And in that brief, weightless moment, before words, before movement, the dynamic was already clear. The encounter was no longer about confrontation. It was about presence, perception, and the subtle recalibration of authority. Bruce Lee did not move. He remained at the edge of the training space, posture relaxed, hands low by his sides, weight evenly distributed. Yet his stillness was deliberate, not passive. Every slight shift in the room, the subtle creak of the floorboards under Tyson's steps, the faint whisper of an assistant adjusting gloves, the soft echo of movement in the ring, was registered and accounted for. Witnesses would later recall that his attention was not scattered. It was total, unbroken, and impossible to distract. Tyson's energy, by contrast, was immediate and physical. The way he shifted his weight from one foot to another, The natural sway of his shoulders, the barely perceptible tension in his hands, all projected force. Those around him instinctively recognized the kinetic potential in every micro-movement. Yet Bruce Lee's presence altered the perception of that energy not by matching it, but by absorbing and redirecting it through observation. As Tyson approached, Bruce's eyes tracked his movements with a calm intensity that seemed disproportionate to the small space he occupied. There was no overt challenge, no attempt to engage. Yet, in that observation, the room itself began to recalibrate. Subtle shifts occurred, assistants paused mid-task, trainers adjusted their stance unconsciously, and even Tyson's own micro-adjustments slowed, a brief hesitation that suggested he had encountered something unfamiliar. It was not a surprise. It was recognition. Bruce Lee's awareness projected a quiet authority. It was a presence that did not demand attention, but that compelled acknowledgement. Observers described it as a kind of gravitational pull, not of physical force, but of focus, control, and subtle mastery. One trainer later recounted how he had felt the room itself leaning toward him, as if Bruce's awareness extended beyond his body, shaping the perception of space around him. Tyson, for his part, did not act aggressively. He did not posture. His eyes met Bruce Lee's briefly, a flicker of calculation passing in that instant. Even for a man conditioned to dominance, the sensation was unusual, a presence that did not threaten but asserted itself entirely through observation and control. Tyson's movements became measured, each step conscious, as if the room had introduced an unseen boundary. Witnesses would later describe the energy as paradoxical. Bruce Lee was smaller, physically less imposing, and yet he radiated authority in a way that altered behavior around him. It was not intimidation in the conventional sense. There were no growls, no overt gestures. It was awareness made manifest, precise, contained, and absolute. Every movement by Tyson, every micro-adjustment was accounted for without a single motion from Bruce Lee beyond what his posture required. The tension in the room increased subtly, imperceptible to those not attuned to nuance. There was no noise, no dramatic flaring of aggression, but the observers felt a shift nonetheless. The space itself seemed to hum with the contrast between kinetic force and silent mastery. Bruce's presence had become a stabilizing and disruptive force simultaneously, stable in its calm, disruptive in its capacity to unsettle assumptions about power. For those present, it was a lesson in observation before action. Authority did not need to be vocalized, nor did mastery require display. Bruce Lee demonstrated, without moving beyond his own stillness, that control could exist entirely within the mind and body, manifesting outwardly only when necessary. Tyson's aura of force was undeniable, yet in the subtle interplay of awareness, it was already being quietly measured, contained, and reframed. By the time the room had fully adjusted to Bruce Lee's observed awareness, the encounter had already shifted from potential confrontation to study, a silent dance of perception, timing, and psychological recalibration. The stage had been set, the players defined, and the rules of engagement had been rewritten before a single strike or overt gesture occurred. And in that quiet, controlled observation, the first element of mastery had been demonstrated. Presence alone could influence the strongest of forces. The space between them closed slowly, measured by circumstance rather than urgency. Bruce Lee and Mike Tyson, each aware of the other, came within a few steps of proximity. No words were exchanged, and no gesture invited engagement. It was an alignment of presence, a moment where energy, perception, and awareness intersected. The room seemed to shrink around them, the ambient noise of shifting feet, creaking ropes, and faint hum of fluorescent lights fading into near silence. Bruce Lee's stance was subtle, feet shoulder-width apart, knees slightly bent, hands relaxed at his sides. He made no preparatory gestures, no signs of anticipation. His eyes tracked Tyson's micro-movements, but without haste. Each motion of Tyson's broad shoulders, each slight tilt of his head was noted internally, absorbed, and assessed. To an outsider, Bruce's stillness might have seemed passive, but to those present, it radiated complete readiness. the calm of a predator who does not need to strike because he has already measured every variable. Tyson, moving naturally but cautiously, mirrored none of the aggression he was known for in the ring. His shoulders were relaxed, his gaze steady, but there was a subtle modulation in his posture. Shoulders slightly lowered, chest angled differently, feet finding balance in a manner that suggested instinctive recalibration. Even the smallest adjustments carried meaning. Observers noted how his massive frame, usually impossible to ignore, now carried a subtle uncertainty, tempered by Bruce Lee's silent authority. The tension was visible, but in a restrained, almost imperceptible way. No one in the room shifted dramatically. No sudden movements, no dramatic gestures. Yet every observer, from trainers to assistants, sensed that something had changed. The psychological weight of the encounter was palpable, a quiet negotiation of space, attention, and latent power. Everyone held themselves with heightened awareness, as though even a small misstep might alter the balance. Bruce's eyes never wavered, his breathing controlled, his presence grounded in every micro-movement and absence thereof. He projected clarity, an authority that required no assertion, a confidence born not from size but from precise knowledge of what was possible and what was not. Tyson, experienced and unflinching, responded instinctively. His movements, even as he appeared relaxed, were subtly measured, every muscle, every footfall adjusting to the quiet energy Bruce exuded. Observers later recalled the stillness as charged yet unforced. It was not tension for spectacle, it was perception in equilibrium. Bruce Lee's presence did not compel submission through intimidation, nor did it provoke aggression. It simply existed, and in its existence, it altered the way Tyson and the room interacted. The dynamic was complete without physical engagement. For a fleeting moment, measured in seconds, but felt as minutes, the two stood as equal points of influence. Size and force on one side, precision and awareness on the other. Each measured the other, not with confrontation, but with complete observation. It was a silent convergence, a meeting of extremes in the same space, and the room itself held its breath. When the moment passed, it was clear to every witness that an unspoken truth had been established. Mastery could exist without aggression. Authority could assert itself without noise. And even the largest force could be subtly realigned by quiet presence. The encounter had not yet concluded, but the trajectory of the room's energy had already shifted. Tyson's natural dominance had been met with a counterweight that did not strike, did not challenge, but recalibrated perception entirely. And in that silence, the audience, trainers, assistants, and onlookers, felt the first true imprint of what Bruce Lee's mastery could do in the presence of unparalleled force. The moment of action was so brief and so subtle that most observers could barely describe it afterward. Bruce Lee did not lunge, did not feint, did not strike. His demonstration was almost imperceptible. A micro-adjustment in stance, a slight shift in weight, a repositioning of his center of gravity that, to the untrained eye, might have seemed inconsequential. Yet the effect was immediate. Tyson, standing only a few feet away, registered the movement instinctively. His shoulders shifted, his stance altered, his natural rhythm adjusted in the briefest of microseconds. There was no outward reaction, no vocal acknowledgement, no aggressive retort. Yet the balance of authority in the room had quietly tilted. The air between them, once charged with potential, now carried a subtle but absolute recognition of Bruce Lee's control. Witnesses later described it as the room pausing, though no one had consciously stopped. Movements slowed, conversations that had begun faded mid-sentence, and even the fluorescent hum seemed to recede into silence. Bruce Lee's demonstration required no force. It required no engagement beyond what his body had already mastered. It was precision rendered visible through minimal motion, an embodiment of efficiency and restraint. Tyson's response was internal, almost invisible. His body, so accustomed to dominating the ring through raw power, adjusted itself to an authority that demanded no confrontation. Observers noted the subtle recalibration, a micro step back, a slight lowering of hands, a conscious redistribution of weight. Tyson's presence remained formidable, but the certainty that usually accompanied his dominance was now tempered by respect for the unseen efficiency of Bruce Lee's mastery. No one in the room spoke, no one needed to. The demonstration had conveyed its message silently. Authority did not require noise, mastery did not require display, and even the most physically imposing presence could be subtly shifted without contact or aggression. The observers felt the shift immediately. Their perception of power, of hierarchy, of possibility, had been altered by a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if it weren't for the reactions it triggered. Bruce Lee did not repeat the motion. He did not look at Tyson, and he did not acknowledge the effect. He returned to his calm, balanced posture, as if the demonstration had been nothing more than a natural adjustment of his own body. The room, however, carried the echo of the event. Tyson's stance, the subtle rigidity in his frame, the slight hesitation in his breathing, all were evidence of the unspoken impact. The moment was complete in less than 4 seconds. Yet in that minimal demonstration, Bruce Lee had conveyed the totality of his mastery, precision, timing, awareness, and control. No force was needed beyond what his presence and subtle movement already asserted. And for those witnessing it, the lesson was undeniable. The quietest action could carry the most decisive weight. The room remained still for several heartbeats after the movement. Observers felt the authority embedded in the air, and they understood, without explanation, that the hierarchy of perception had been fundamentally altered. Bruce Lee had acted decisively but invisibly, proving that mastery was less about confrontation and more about subtle, complete understanding of space, timing, and human response. By the time anyone could process what had happened, the moment had already concluded. Yet its imprint remained, a recalibration of energy, a silent acknowledgement that dominance could exist without struggle, and that even the most imposing force could be influenced by a single, perfectly executed adjustment. The shift did not announce itself with drama, yet it was undeniable. After Bruce Lee's minimal demonstration, the room's energy had subtly but decisively changed. Tyson, for all his size and conditioning, adjusted in ways that were invisible unless one watched closely. A fraction of an inch in foot placement, a micro-tension in the shoulders, a brief, almost imperceptible pause in his breathing. Nothing overt, nothing theatrical, yet the recalibration was complete. Observers later described the sensation as a quiet redistribution of authority. Tyson's physical presence remained formidable, but the certainty that had defined it, the instinctive assumption that sheer force alone could dominate the space, was now tempered. Bruce Lee's calm had imposed a measure of restraint, a psychological boundary, without uttering a word or raising a fist. The demonstration was both invisible and absolute, the kind that left no opportunity for argument or counteraction. The subtlety was its power. Tyson's gaze, once casual and confident, flickered with an unspoken acknowledgement, a recognition of precision, timing, and awareness that he could sense but not quantify. Every muscle of his body responded instinctively, a quiet adjustment to a presence that had rewritten the parameters of interaction. Witnesses noted how Tyson's massive frame, usually unyielding and imposing, now carried the weight of measured awareness. Around them, the small cadre of assistants and trainers felt the recalibration as well. Movements that had begun naturally, adjusting gloves, shifting weight, talking quietly, slowed or froze. They instinctively mirrored the adjustment, not out of fear, but because the room's rhythm had changed. Energy flowed differently now, subtle but palpable. What had been an ordinary presence became a demonstration of authority that required no noise, no gesture, no struggle. Bruce Lee remained as still as ever, his eyes calm, his posture unwavering. There was no attempt to dominate further, no invitation for engagement. His mastery was not in proving superiority, but in allowing the room, and even a figure as imposing as Tyson, to experience the recalibration through subtle influence alone. The effect was not humiliation, nor was it intimidation. It was understanding, a silent acknowledgement that presence, awareness, and precise action could alter assumptions and reshape dynamics in an instant. Witnesses would later say that the room seemed lighter but also more concentrated. The tension had not vanished. It had transformed. The shift was psychological, internal, not external. The physical hierarchy remained visible. Tyson still occupied space with undeniable mass, but the perceived dominance, the instinctive assertion of control, had quietly adjusted. Tyson's authority now coexisted with Bruce Lee's mastery, and the interplay was visible to anyone attuned to nuance. It was a lesson without instruction, a demonstration without spectacle. No one had been struck, no words had been exchanged, yet the understanding was clear to all present. Mastery could influence the most formidable force through observation, awareness, and subtle, precise action alone. The room had been altered, and those who witnessed it understood that authority could exist independently of size, strength, or volume. By the end of the recalibration, Bruce Lee and Tyson both maintained composure, yet the energy in the space had permanently shifted. Observers later described the moment as an almost sacred pause, a brief window in which the nature of power and influence had been quietly rewritten. The demonstration had concluded, yet its effect lingered, a subtle imprint on perception, a quiet acknowledgement that mastery and authority could coexist without struggle, and that even the largest force could be influenced without confrontation. Bruce Lee turned to leave. He did not bow, nod, or speak. His movement was deliberate, calm, and unhurried, as if walking down the corridor of a familiar building rather than exiting a space that had just witnessed a rare convergence of mastery. Each step was measured yet natural, his weight evenly distributed, posture relaxed but precise. Hands remained at his sides, eyes forward, body fully aware of the room and its occupants, yet completely at ease. Tyson remained behind. He did not chase, did not gesture, did not call after him. His massive frame stayed composed, shoulders squared, chest relaxed. Observers later noted that Tyson's breathing had subtly returned to a steady rhythm, but the imperceptible tension in his stance lingered. Even in the absence of movement or confrontation, the psychological imprint of Bruce Lee's presence had not left. The space carried it, like a residue in the air, felt but unspoken. Those in the room, trainers, assistants, and onlookers, watched silently. No one moved to fill the void left by Bruce's departure. Conversations did not immediately resume. The hum of fluorescent lights and the faint creak of floorboards were the only sounds. Yet the dynamics had irrevocably shifted. Bruce's exit was not triumphant, it was not performative. Its significance lay in its quiet assertion, mastery does not demand recognition, and authority does not need applause. The subtle effect on Tyson was visible only to the careful observer. His stance adjusted slightly, his posture micro-corrected, as if recalibrating the energy of the room now that the most influential variable had departed. There was no resentment, no aggression, only acknowledgement. A silent concession to precision, control, and understanding displayed without spectacle. Tyson's aura remained commanding, but it now coexisted with a deeper awareness of mastery that did not rely on brute force alone. For the witnesses, the departure carried as much weight as the encounter itself. Bruce Lee had left without fanfare, yet his influence persisted. The room felt different, smaller, sharper, more concentrated. The ordinary sounds of a gym, the shuffle of feet, the soft thuds of punching bags, the distant clatter of equipment, seemed to reverberate differently, carrying a resonance of the moment just concluded. This was not about winning, not about proving strength. It was about demonstrating that presence, awareness, and subtle action could silently recalibrate the most formidable forces in a space. The departure made that demonstration complete. No confrontation remained, no challenge lingered, yet the hierarchy of influence had been quietly rewritten. In those final steps, Bruce Lee exemplified a principle that would define his legend: authority is proven in restraint, mastery is demonstrated through precision, and the true measure of influence is its enduring quiet effect on those who witness it. The room resumed motion eventually, but the memory of his presence lingered, embedded in the subtle shifts of posture, the stillness in movement, and the unspoken understanding that mastery had quietly left its mark. Years later, the encounter existed largely in fragments of memory, anecdotes shared quietly among trainers, assistants, and fighters who had witnessed it firsthand. No footage captured the moment. No headline chronicled it, yet, for those present, the significance never faded. It was remembered not as a confrontation, but as an example of what mastery could accomplish without spectacle, aggression, or conflict. Observers described how the energy of that brief convergence had lingered long after Bruce Lee had walked away. Tyson, in interviews and training sessions afterward, would sometimes reference moments of unexpected clarity and awareness in his own practice. He never recounted the event as a defeat, nor did he dramatize it. It was a lesson absorbed quietly, a reminder of subtlety and precision, and the undeniable authority that could exist in silence. The room itself, the private training space, became part of the story. Those who returned later reported that it retained an almost tangible sense of expectation. New fighters and assistants spoke of the weight of presence, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the memory of that brief but decisive demonstration. The incident became a quiet benchmark for understanding control, influence, and mastery. The enduring lesson was psychological, not physical. Bruce Lee's authority was not measured by the size of his opponent or the power of his strike, but by the depth of his awareness, the precision of his movements, and the restraint with which he applied them. Tyson's massive presence, once unchallenged in its immediate perception, was subtly reframed. Authority and dominance were no longer purely external. They could exist internally, projected outward through observation, control, and timing. Over time, the story circulated quietly among those who valued martial arts as more than a contest of strength. Trainers told it to students not as a tale of victory, but as a lesson in perception, discipline, and the quiet recalibration of authority. It became part of a larger mythology of Bruce Lee's philosophy. Mastery is most potent when it is unspoken, when it shapes understanding through demonstration rather than declaration. In retrospect, the encounter exemplified a rare convergence of forces, the overwhelming kinetic presence of one of the most physically dominant fighters of his era, measured against the restrained, precise authority of someone whose power was both internal and external. No one had lost, and no one had won in the conventional sense. The significance lay in the lasting impression, the subtle but undeniable shift in perception, and the reaffirmation that true mastery leaves traces not in spectacle, but in understanding. The legend endured quietly. Stories were told, retold, and reflected upon, each witness carrying a personal imprint of that brief moment. Bruce Lee's demonstration of subtle authority became a benchmark for those who understood that power is most profound when it is unasserted, influence most potent when it is silent, and mastery most enduring when it shapes the minds and awareness of all who witness it. And so, the encounter, lasting mere seconds, remained with those present for decades, a testament to restraint, precision, and the quiet, unshakable weight of true mastery.